Okay, cycling, the one returning mechanic. Everyone wants cycling in their sets because it smooths things out and it allows you to have mechanics that are a little harder to put the pieces together, like mutate. Originally, it was harder to find things to mutate onto, and I think cycling helped with that. It also helped, if you have bigger creatures that you don't want it to just be battle cruiser ramping up into your big creature, but you want to be able to do something else with that. That putting cycling on those things made sense. But yeah, how did you like cycling in this set? You're generally a big fan of cycling as an ability, right?
I am generally not a big fan of cycling as an ability. I loved
Uh,
cycling in this set, but cycling as an ability overall, I think is a net negative fun ability.
hmm,
Because generally speaking, you do not put cards in your deck because you don't want to cast them.
yeah.
Like I put fun cards in my deck because I want to cast them. And so what very often happens with cycling is you get to put this terrible card in your deck, but it has cycling. And so then like you either play the card that costs too much mana for what it does, or you cycle it and then you end up flooded on land. And so all of these kinds of things end up being bad. Uh, and so I think there's a lot of unfun stuff that can happen with cycling in a lot of sets.
It can also lead to swingier designs being more main decked more often. That makes sense. And so you end up with
Right. Yeah,
these
like
like
I don't
bigger
love
swings back and
naturalize.
forth.
Yeah, like I don't love naturalize as a card to begin with because it's so swingy. But when you have naturalize plus it has cycling, like in Amonkhet, then suddenly you're playing your artifact, and even in game one, your opponent nabs it with a naturalize that they were just spotting themselves to enable their cycling triggers or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and that feels bad. Um,
And
however, what was I going to say? But you liked the way they did it here. Why is that?
yeah, so I'll say also this is a second point about cycling. A lot of sets that have cycling also have cycling payoffs, and I
Yeah,
feel like it's very weird when the cycling payoff is rewarding you for not playing your cards.
that's true.
But when we get to Ikoria, they introduce something that they've basically never done before, which is cards that cycle for one. And one is so very much less than two, and they really put cycling on the right collection of cards so that you never feel bad cycling your one cost cycling cards. So
And it
Frostvale
feels
Ambush,
good when you don't. Like I've cast some of my cycling one cards a surprising amount of times. When
like the
normally I
3/6
look at it.
Vigilance. Like if you got 6 lands, a 3/6 Vigilance, I mean, that's a card.
Yeah.
But if you don't, you look at the 3/6 Vigilance and you're like, why on earth is this in my deck? And then it feels good to be able to like just throw away a stray mana and just dump the card. So the fact that it gives you something to do on turn one, even, is pretty exciting because it's like, okay, I look at my hand and then I see, like, okay, in my hand, which of these things do I actually want versus which of them do I not? I'm not going to play a one drop usually on turn one anyway. So then I can just sort of free roll this thing.
Yeah.
So
Um,
I feel like they found exactly the right sweet spot with the cycling cards in this set and the cycling payoffs in this set that I found it felt basically universally good.
yeah. And I think that the fun thing about cycling in this set is that you can go real deep on it and it encourages you to go deep on it. And the cards that cycle are like they still have some play within those decks sometimes. So you're drafting them just for the pay one mana draw card ability, but they still end up being played in kind of strange situations. And I feel clever when I end up doing that, and I feel great when I draw through my whole deck. One of my favorite things in Dominion is drawing my whole deck in a turn. And the cycling deck in Ikoria kind of brings me that feel of building a weird deck that can't get built in other environments. I feel like that puts a stamp on the limited environment as you can do something here you can't do in other sets. You can make this really unique deck that does something that's a unique experience.
And that's really what I love about Ikoria is I felt a lot of my decks I drafted were unique.
Oh
And
yeah,
even I kind of want to say, oh, the cycling deck is like the spider spawning deck of the format, but I think actually cycling decks had a lot of play to them in that you really had to adjust based on what build arounds you had to make sure that you could actually kill your opponent before you decked yourself. So it's
yeah.
really easy. Like if you did not have enough zenith flares, you really had to carefully plan. Like if I'm only going to be allowed to cast 10 cards out of my 40 card deck, I better make sure that those 10 cards are capable of dealing 20 damage. And
And
that was often
the
interesting.
yeah. Yeah, that was interesting, but it's also like when you fail in the cycling deck, that's still fun because the reason you fail is that you've drawn so much of your deck in the wrong order, but you've still drawn a lot of your deck. You know what I mean? Like you're still seeing lots of cards, and maybe you cycled the wrong card at the wrong time. Maybe you should have played one card instead of cycled it, and uh, you fail spectacularly if that makes sense.
Yeah,
It's a
absolutely. I agree with that.
yeah. And anytime a game design allows you to fail in a fun way, I like that moment a lot. But it is interesting, like you brought up the point that the payoffs are all very different. You have the one mana fox that gets bigger anytime you cycle. That's obviously great turn one. But then later you might just want to use it to turn on a reptilian reflection or to help you get to the 8/8 Kraken from the more value based uh, bigger cycling payoff in blue, which the ominous seas, which was one of my favorite cards.
Betha. That is like the meest card ever, I feel like.
Yeah. Um, so that was really fun. That cycling deck in particular, but also how cycling just kind of bled out into a bunch of different decks. Because you had like some removal spells with cycling that weren't, tier one removal spells, but sometimes you just need a removal spell, and sometimes it's not the right thing for the situation. You can cycle it away. I think the decision to make cycling a little bit cheaper and allowing it to be on a little bit better cards was correct in making it feel different from previous instances of cycling, but also just making it play better because there's so much downside with cycling. Like you said, it's too often a net unfun because players like their cards. They don't like getting rid of their cards to get other cards. Otherwise, they just have those other cards they wanted in the first place. Um, I like one thing that they've done in previous sets, and they also did here, is to make the exciting part about the card the cycling. And so they did that with a lot of the payoffs. You notice that some of the payoffs have cycling themselves to kind of draw attention to the fact that you can use this to cycle for your other payoffs, or your other cycling cards can help this card be exciting, so that the whole package kind of feels interesting. But you also had the really big creatures with cycling that put counters on creatures you control. I thought those played fairly interestingly, although too often they never ended up getting cast. They're mostly reanimated or just used kind of as a trick. But sometimes they were cast, like you said with the 3/6 Vigilant Cycler. Sometimes you have 6 mana and you draw that off the top of the deck, and it's just nice to play a big creature that uses all your mana. But I liked that uncommon cycle of uh, cycling monsters that put keyword counters on creatures you control, because that makes getting rid of the card also exciting. But playing a huge creature is also exciting too. So it's you're choosing between two things that are both great instead of choosing between something that's very mundane, which is just drawing a card, or playing a really swingy card that sometimes never does anything.
Yeah, I think that the example of the sort of thing that I think you can't do too much is Lava Serpent, where it's a 6 mana 5/5 haste, which is great, but it has cycling 2. So if you can't cast it, then
Yeah.
you do that. But then you end up in the situation where you really want to cast your 5/5 haste. And so it does often feel bad if you're like, especially if you're in that game that we've all been in where you're sitting on 5 lands and you don't have anything.
Yeah.
except for Lava Serpent, and you're like, do I cycle it? Do I not cycle it? And of course, you cycle it, and you draw a land, and
Yeah.
then everyone is sad. Um,
See, I like that that moment's possible, but I also hate that it happens. You know what I mean? Like I like that it's a risk reward thing that players have to decide. It gives players more modality, right? Like more ways to fail, but also more ways to feel like they have agency, which I guess is the issue with the human condition. But the issue is that failing feels so bad with the designs like that in situations like that. Um,
and I think like there aren't a lot of those in this set, so I think it's fine to have that happen.
yeah,
But
on a few
you
designs.
go back to like if every cycling card is like that, where it's sort of like painful to cycle it because you really want to cast it, but you're just not getting to the land or whatever, and then you end up just flooding out or whatever, that ends up being bad.
Yeah. Any last things about cycling before we move on to companions?
What did you think about the fact that the set so strongly encouraged you to play a lot of cycling one cards that you could not possibly cast?
I like that occasionally in Magic because it feels like I'm breaking a rule, and I like that's one of the things I like about Magic is feeling like you can be smarter than the game designers sometimes. Like you can break. Um, I don't like feeling like I'm only doing play patterns that have been prescribed to me by the people who made the game. I want. I like the how the game feels so vast and there's so many possibilities that you can explore uncharted areas and uncharted strategies. Not that like playing cycling one cards from other colors is some trans some major transgression that no one's thought of before, right? I'm not saying that, but I do like the transgressive feeling of, oh, I don't have any black in my deck, but I'm still putting memory leak in my deck. Um, I liked that actually, but it's not something I would want in every set.
I'd agree. I thought it was a really neat thing, and this will come up again in my soapbox later. Uh,
Okay.
but one more question: how far along on the skill spectrum do you think you have to be to appreciate that cycling one is really cool? Because like we
Hmm.
both think it's cool and really fun. I'm curious if there's I'm curious how much you have to be steeped in the history of the idea that cycling has to cost two before it's exciting to be able to cycle things for one.
The potential moment I'm thinking of that could be awful is you're a newish player, you're playing against somebody at a non-existent in-person FNM, right? Because of COVID-19. And you play against this cycling deck that you didn't know was a thing because you were on a different track in the draft, right? Like you found black white humans or whatever, and you're playing against this red white deck that has black and green cards that they're cycling, and you're like, this deck is so dumb. It's doing something really powerful, and it's even using cards that aren't even in its colors. It feels like they're cheating somehow, and you just can't quite put your finger on it, even though it's fair, right? It's just because they evaluated it better than the new player. I could see that feeling unfair. Like, oh my gosh, they're just doing something dumb that they shouldn't be able to do. Like, how are you able to use these cards that aren't even in your color? Um,
Or especially if you were in the draft with them and they're playing cards that are in your colors that they can't cast that you would have wanted for your deck.
oh gosh, yeah. Although there aren't very many
I
of
think there are
those,
a ton of examples of those, yeah, that I think like you're not going to be that sad you didn't get your Frostveil ambush or whatever.
or you're suffocating fumes or something like that. Yeah. Well, I think the Frostville ambush, it's nice that blue, red, and white, like the colors that have the cards that you're most likely to miss because they have cycling, are also the colors that care the most about cycling. And so you don't really evaluate them as though I only want to cast this and not be in a cycling deck. That seems less likely to happen as it would if there was some really great black card with cycling that keeps getting taken from you by the white red cycling player. Like the black cards with cycling are very sideboardy, more classic cycling designs, like memory leak um, and suffocating fumes. Um, yeah, so that's cycling once again. Um,
We'll be back.
yes, it will. Oh, my last thing on cycling, I liked that a lot of the build arounds also had cycling. I kind of mentioned that with the Fox and how they kind of point to your whole deck caring about cycling, but those cards themselves also being able to be used to turn on the other build arounds. I'm not explaining it well, but I just kind of like how that makes the whole card feel when it all itself also has cycling. It feels less bad to draw more than one of it for obvious reasons. Um, but
Cycling deck
yeah,
really felt like a cube deck in a way that I guess that's true of a lot of the decks in Ikoria, where it really felt like you were putting together a plan for your deck in a coherent way. The reanimation deck, which was also based around cycling, I felt the same way of like, oh yes, on turn 4, I'm going to cheat out this 7/7, and now it's going to have a lifelink counter, and it's going to kill one of your things, and then the game is going to end.
yeah,
That kind of thing is a pretty neat layer to this format.
that can be bad sometimes. Like I wonder if maybe they went a little too far with the cycling deck, but the cycling deck fails often enough that like the times that it just works, it feels kind of unstoppable. But it's not like they have hexproof on their big creatures. You know what I mean? Like if you just have instant speed removal and save it for the right times, the deck is not unbeatable. Um,
It was really hard to deal with Zenith. That was
that's
like you
true.
really wanted to have a neutralize because that was the card that could deal with Zenith Flare.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at the counter spells. I think they only had a creature-based counter spell, perhaps at
There's
common.
Essence Scatter, and then there's Convolute, but Convolute usually could not counter Zenith
Yeah,
Flare because
because
usually
you're
they were
doing it
countering
late in the game,
on their
and
whole deck.
convolute is not a great card to main deck generally. I don't think in this format.
And even worse, you're definitely not going to bring it in against cycling, I don't think, most of the time. Um,
Yeah, that's true.
I do think Convolute was the best it's ever been in this set for what it's worth, but it was still not good.
Huh. Yeah, that's probably fair. Okay, so
I
now let's.
actually ended up feeling like Essence Scatter was the best common set of
Yeah,
how it just destroyed mutate. Uh,
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways to destroy mutate, but uh, yeah, it went a long way in being a very proactive removal spell because this whole set is very creature focused. Yeah,
Even
I think that
Blood
was
Curdle
my
just
top
have
blue
all their
common.
stupid triggers, whereas Essence Scatter they don't even get that, and so then they just tap out to play their Auspicious Starix or whatever, and it's like ha 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 ha.
Yeah, exactly.